A scent can be a silent ghost, and for me, it's the smell of fresh-cut pine. It's an aroma that, instead of carrying good memories, digs graves. It doesn't do it with the violent force of a shovel, but with the slow, inexorable precision of roots insinuating themselves into the cracks of a crumbling stone wall. It digs deep into the soul, reawakening phantoms I thought were buried under decades of dust, and a silence even thicker than that dust. For some people, it's the smell of rain on dry earth that promises life, but instead brings back an ancient loss. For others, it's the scent of an old book, whose yellowed pages don't tell the story printed there, but the one lived between its lines. Mine is the scent of fresh sawdust, of pine and spruce. My name is Patricia, and I am 72 years old. Please subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and leave a like on this video. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? For most of my childhood, that pungent, woody scent wasn't a grave. It was my nest, my fortress, the very essence of the word home. It was the smell of my father, Walter. It was the smell that permeated his work clothes, his skin, and that seemed to fill every room of our small house on the edge of town. His hands, always covered in a fine golden dust, were the most skilled, most respected hands that our small community, nestled between two wooded hills, had ever known. Walter wasn't simply a carpenter, he was a craftsman, a poet of wood. People said he could feel the soul of a tree by simply resting his palm on it. From his strong, calloused hands came furniture that was a promise of eternity, intricately carved doors that seemed to bless whoever crossed their threshold, and perfect small wooden toys that he gave to the children on our street, whose smiles were a currency more precious to him than any dollar. To everyone in our town, where life flowed to the rhythm of the seasons and the church bells, my father was a righteous man, a pillar. His word was a contract, his handshake a seal. When a late summer storm ripped part of the church roof off, it was Walter who led the men of the town, working for free from sunup to sundown to repair the house of the Lord. When a farmer's son, a turbulent and aimless boy, was at risk of going down the wrong path, it was my father who took him on as an apprentice in his workshop, teaching him not only a trade, but also discipline and respect. He transformed him, everyone said, from a crooked piece of wood into a sturdy and honest piece of furniture. My father was the beating heart of our community, a man whose presence was as solid and reassuring as the ancient oaks he so loved and respected. His workshop, a large wooden and stone building next to our house, was my kingdom, my refuge. It was a magical place for me. The morning light entered through the high, dusty windows, cutting the dense air into golden columns where a myriad of wooden dust particles danced. The air itself seemed alive, vibrating with the constant hypnotic hum of his machines, and filled with that scent that, for me, was synonymous with safety and paternal love. I would spend entire afternoons sitting on a stool in a corner, watching him work, completely fascinated by the symbiosis between him and the material. It was a silent and powerful dance, the plane sliding over the surface of a board, revealing its hidden grains, the chisel carving with millimeter precision, giving life to a flower or a leaf, the saw singing, separating the superfluous to reveal the essence. In those moments, when he looked at me and smiled, winking as he measured a piece of wood, he was the kindest and most powerful man in the world. He was my daddy. My mother, Lillian, was his polar opposite, the silence to his noise, the shadow to his light. She was a woman whose presence was so discreet, so ethereal, that at times she seemed almost transparent. She moved through our immaculate house with a furtive grace, her steps light on the wooden floor, as if she had an ancestral fear of making too much noise, of disturbing the sacred order imposed by my father, of occupying a single inch more space than necessary. Her smiles were rare and fragile events, like wildflowers struggling to grow in rocky soil. They lasted an instant and then vanished, leaving a trace of melancholy in their wake. Often, when I helped her hang clothes or pick vegetables from the garden, I would notice a purplish bruise on her forearm or a swelling on her cheekbone that she tried to hide with her hair. When I asked her, with the innocent curiosity of a child, what had happened, her answer was a script recited from memory, a whispered lie so as not to be heard. "I tripped again, my dear Patricia. You know how clumsy I am, always with my head in the clouds." And I believed her. Children possess an almost divine trust, an unbounded capacity to accept the reality presented to them, because to imagine the alternative would mean the collapse of their entire world. And my world rested on two certainties. My father was the good, strong hero of the town, and my mother was simply a very, very absent-minded woman. Our home, in my child's eyes, was a place of peace, a sanctuary of order and cleanliness, where silence reigned supreme. I didn't understand then that there are different types of silence. There is the silence of peace, and there is the silence of fear. Ours was the latter. The first cracks in that facade of perfection began to appear like thin veins in the wood. They were almost imperceptible moments, flashes of another reality that vanished so quickly that I doubted I had truly seen them. I remember one autumn evening. I must have been about 15. My mother had spent the entire afternoon cooking pot roast, my father's favorite dish. The house smelled of rosemary and red wine, an almost festive atmosphere. We were sitting at the table in the usual, almost sacred silence that accompanied our dinners. My father served himself a generous portion, brought it to his mouth, and chewed slowly with the concentration of a judge savoring evidence. Then he placed his fork on the edge of the plate. The small clang of metal on ceramic echoed through the room like a hammer blow. "There's too much salt," he said. His voice wasn't angry. It was worse. It was flat, cold, and devoid of any emotion. It was the voice he used to pronounce a sentence. I saw my mother flinch as if she had been struck. She lowered her gaze to her plate. "I'm sorry, Walter. Maybe my hand slipped when I was pouring it." "Your hand slipped," he repeated, like an empty echo. He didn't look at her. He continued to eat, but every bite seemed like an accusation, every movement of his jaw an act of condemnation. The air in the room grew heavy, dense, and almost unbreathable. I stopped eating. My stomach had clenched into a tight, painful knot. My mother didn't touch her food again. She remained motionless, her hands clasped in her lap, her face a mask of controlled neutrality. When my father had finished, he meticulously wiped his mouth with his napkin, then folded it carefully beside his plate. He rose and, without a glance at my mother, without saying a word, headed for the door. Moments later, we heard the shrill, angry wail of the bandsaw starting up in the workshop. That was his way of expressing himself, his language. He didn't waste breath on yelling or scolding. He let the deafening noise of his machines punish the house, filling every corner with his dissatisfaction. My mother sat rigid for what felt like an eternity. The wail of the saw continued, a sound that grated on my nerves. Then, with slow, mechanical movements, like an automaton, she began to clear the table. Her hands trembled so much that the plates clinked against each other, a small, desperate concert of fragility. When she bent down to take my plate, our gazes met for a second, and in that second I saw a single tear escape her control, slide down her cheek, and fall onto the white linen tablecloth, leaving a small, dark stain. She said nothing. There was no sob, no wail. Only that silent, solitary testimony of a pain too deep to be expressed in words. That night, curled up in my bed, the smell of sawdust coming from my father's clothes, hung on the chair, seemed poisonous for the first time. It was no longer the reassuring, protective scent of my hero. It was a harsh, sharp smell, imbued with a cold anger and a cruel power. I covered my head with the blankets, trying to breathe only the clean air of my room, but it was useless. The smell was everywhere. It was in the curtains, in the furniture, in my very breath. It was the smell of our house. It was the smell of fear. As the years went by, I became an expert in reading the signs, an interpreter of silences. I learned to know when my father's mood was about to change by the way he placed his tools on the workbench. A fluid, harmonious gesture meant peace. A sharp, metallic clang was a harbinger of a storm. Our life became a delicate and exhausting dance around his imposing figure, a constant, desperate effort not to step on the invisible emotional landmines he scattered on our daily path. The tension in the house was a physical presence, a third guest at the table, a shadow that stretched even on the sunniest days. And yet, as soon as we crossed the threshold of our home, the charade resumed, impeccable. Walter, the good carpenter. Walter, the man with a heart of gold, always ready with a kind word. I would see him smiling at the neighbors, joking with the minister, and a part of me, the child who desperately wanted to believe, wondered if I was the one who was crazy. Maybe I was exaggerating. Maybe I was imagining everything. Maybe my mother was really just absent-minded, and my father was simply a demanding man, a perfectionist, as they said with admiration in town. This was the life I knew, a precarious and insane balance between the love the world saw and the terror I felt. A constant swing between pride for the father everyone admired and fear of the man who waited for us in silence behind the front door. For years, I lived in this fog, in this twilight of the soul, believing that this was simply the way the world worked, that every family had its silences, its hidden tears. But the true darkness, the kind that doesn't just frighten but devours the soul, the kind that leaves scars so deep that even 40 years of life cannot erase, had not yet arrived. It was waiting, patient and hungry, just outside our door, wearing the smiling and respectable face of a man whom everyone, including me, considered a friend. That man, that harbinger of a darkness I didn't yet know, had a name that in our town was pronounced with a mixture of respect and awe. Mr. Gerald Peterson. No one, not even the oldest men who played cards in front of the coffee shop in the square, would ever dream of calling him by his first name. The Mr. was not a simple title of courtesy. It was an integral part of his identity, an invisible wall that separated him from us common mortals, a constant reminder of his status. He owned the textile mill, the large red brick factory that stood along the river and employed almost half the families in town. The smoke that came from its tall chimney was, to everyone, the breath of the local economy, the sign that there was bread on the table and a roof over their heads. Mr. Peterson was not just a rich man, he was our benevolent patron, the good giant of our small-town fairy tale. As a child, his figure inspired in me a kind of reverential fear. He was a man whose presence seemed to physically fill more space than he actually occupied. When he walked through the square, the chatter would quiet down, men would tip their hats in greeting, and women would bow their heads with a deferential smile. He would reciprocate with a wave of his hand, a smile that seemed paternal to me, and hand out candies to the children who ran to him. I was one of those children. I distinctly remember the rough but warm feeling of his hand on my head, the scent of pipe tobacco and cologne that enveloped him, a smell so different from the wood and sweat of my father. In my child's eyes, my father Walter was the king of his workshop, but Mr. Peterson was the king of the entire world. I remember one summer afternoon. I was with my mother doing the shopping at the only general store in town. The room was crowded and hot, smelling of cheese and sausages hanging from the ceiling. Suddenly, the crowd parted like the waters of the Red Sea. Mr. Peterson had entered. My mother, Lillian, immediately stepped aside, pulling me with her, lowering her gaze as she always did in the presence of authority. But he saw us. His face broke into a wide, kindly smile. "Lillian," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "And this must be little Patricia. She gets prettier every day. She takes after her mother. I felt my mother stiffen beside me. She murmured a barely audible, "Thank you, Mr. Peterson." He leaned down to me, his eyes scrutinizing. In that moment, I saw no harm in it, just an adult's curiosity. He held out a lemon candy, one of those wrapped in shiny yellow paper that made a wonderful sound when you unwrapped it. I took it timidly, whispering a "thank you." He stroked my head again. "Tell that stubborn father of yours that the coffee table he made for me is a masterpiece. A true artist, that man. You must be very proud of him." And we were. In that moment, as I clutched my candy and saw the town's good giant praise my father, I felt a wave of pride so strong it almost made my chest burst. It was further confirmation. My father was a special man, a man admired even by the king. I couldn't wait to get home to tell him everything. But when I told him, my father's reaction was not what I expected. He didn't smile with satisfaction. His face hardened imperceptibly. "Peterson understands wood," he said in his usual flat voice. "But that doesn't give him the right to stop my wife and daughter in the street as if they were his property." I didn't understand. Hadn't he praised his work? Hadn't he been kind? I looked at my mother, searching for an explanation, but she was already clearing the table, her face closed and expressionless. That evening, the silence at dinner was heavier than usual, and for the first time, I began to perceive that the world of adults was a complex and dangerous territory, governed by undercurrents I could not comprehend. As I grew, this feeling became stronger. Our house, so immaculate and tidy on the surface, was in reality an emotional battlefield. It was a silent war, fought without weapons or words, its outcome entirely dependent on my father's mood. My mother and I learned to become human seismographs, capable of detecting the slightest tremors of his temperament. The evening ritual was the most critical moment. We would wait for his return from the workshop, and in those few seconds, the fate of our evening would be decided. The sound of his footsteps on the gravel path was the first signal. A heavy, dragging step meant weariness, and weariness sometimes made him gentle. A quick, decisive step was a red alert. It meant something in his day had gone wrong, a piece of wood had split, a client had argued about the price, and that repressed anger would seek a vent within the walls of our home. Then there was the sound of the door. If it closed with a soft click, we could breathe. If it slammed, even slightly, we held our breath. Once inside, he would head to the sink to wash his hands, and that was also a code. A slow, methodical wash was a good sign. But if the water ran violently, if the soap was scrubbed with fury, then we knew the storm was upon us. On those evenings, dinner was consumed in a tomb-like silence. Every noise, the fork touching the plate, the glass placed on the table, seemed like an explosion. My mother and I ate with our heads down, trying to become invisible, praying not to do anything that might attract his attention. On those evenings, his gaze was like an acetylene torch, capable of burning your soul if it landed on you. And the most frequent target was my mother. It took nothing. An undercooked potato, a shirt not ironed to perfection, a word too many. He almost never yelled. His cruelty was more subtle, more psychological. He punished her with silence, sometimes for days on end. He would ignore her completely, as if she had become invisible, transparent. And for my mother, whose entire world revolved around him, being ignored was a torture worse than any slap. I would see her wither during those silences, moving through the house like a ghost, her face increasingly drawn, her eyes increasingly empty. My father's control extended to every aspect of our lives. He controlled the money with an iron fist. My mother didn't have a penny. Every week she had to present him with the shopping list, and he would examine it like a bookkeeper, questioning every single dollar. Why buy this cheese? The one at the other store costs less. Do you really need a new dishcloth? Can't the old one be mended? I remember the mortification on my mother's face during these interrogations, her dignity being torn to pieces over a few pennies. Even my own life was under his scrutiny. I loved to read. Books were my only escape, wonderful worlds where I could lose myself for hours. But my father saw reading as a waste of time, a useless activity for a girl. "Reading novels won't teach you how to keep a clean house," he would say with contempt. So, I started reading in secret, as if I were committing a crime. I would borrow books from the small parish library and hide them under my mattress, reading them at night by the light of a small flashlight. The fear of being discovered mixed with the pleasure of reading, making every page even more precious and forbidden. In the midst of this oppression, my mother had found her only small sanctuary, the vegetable garden behind the house. That was her kingdom, the only place my father's hands couldn't reach. There, among the rows of tomatoes and zucchini plants, she seemed to transform. Her body, usually bent and tense, would relax. Her face, a mask of anxiety inside the house, would soften as she talked to her plants. It was her act of silent rebellion. My father could control the house, but he couldn't control the land. He couldn't stop a seed from sprouting. One day, while I was helping her pull weeds, I found a young photograph of her in an old tin box. I gasped. The girl in the photo was almost a stranger. She had an open, luminous smile, her eyes shining with a joy for life I had never seen in her. She was holding a bunch of wildflowers and seemed to be laughing heartily. I asked my mother who she was. She took the photo, looked at it for a long moment, and a shadow of pain crossed her face. "That was me," she whispered. "A long time ago." Then she put the photo back in the box and buried it again under a pile of old rags. In that moment, I understood that my father hadn't just stolen her smiles, he had stolen her life. The relationship between the two most powerful men in my life, my father and Mr. Peterson, was complex. They respected each other in their own way. They were two kings, each sovereign of his own kingdom, wood and cloth. Sometimes Mr. Peterson would come to our house. These were rare events that threw my mother into a state of feverish agitation. The house had to be more than perfect. The coffee had to be of the right strength. I remember one of these visits in particular. His daughter was about to get married, and he had commissioned my father to make an inlaid chest as a wedding gift. He came to check on the progress. He entered the workshop, filling the space with his imposing presence and his smell of tobacco. My father, for the first time, seemed almost submissive, but also puffed up with pride as he showed his progress, explaining the choice of wood and the complexity of the inlay. I, an adolescent at the time, was called to offer coffee. I entered the workshop, feeling clumsy and inadequate under the gaze of those two men. As I handed the cup to Mr. Peterson, his eyes settled on me. It wasn't the benevolent gaze I remembered from my childhood. It was different, more intense, more calculating. It lingered on my face, on my budding body, a second longer than necessary. It was a fleeting but chilling sensation, like the touch of an insect on my skin. I felt naked, exposed. Instinctively, I took a step back. He didn't seem to notice, or he pretended not to. He turned back to my father, resuming his talk about the furniture. But I had felt that change. And even more terrifying, I realized that my mother, standing in the doorway, had felt it too. I saw a flash of pure panic in her eyes, a primordial terror I had never seen before. She took a step forward, almost shielding me, and said in an unnaturally shrill voice, "Patricia, go back inside. The water is boiling for the pasta." That evening, after Mr. Peterson had left, the tension in the house was different. It wasn't my father's usual repressed anger. It was something new, a silent anxiety that seemed to emanate from my mother. I watched her as she prepared dinner. Her movements were quick, almost frantic. She avoided my gaze. The turning point, The moment my destiny took a turn from which I could no longer return came a few weeks later. I had finished high school, and like most girls in town, my future seemed to be to learn how to be a housewife and wait for a good husband. But one day, the minister announced that Mr. Peterson was looking for a young, precise girl to work in his office, to help with bookkeeping and filing. It was an incredible opportunity, a lady's job, as it was called then. An honor. When my father heard about it, his eyes shone with a pride he had never shown me. "My daughter," he said, with a note of triumph in his voice, "will work in Gerald Peterson's office. Everyone will see what we're made of." For him, it was a social victory, an affirmation of his status. It was proof that his daughter was worthy of entering the kingdom of the town's king. I was terrified and excited at the same time. The idea of earning my own money, of having a small piece of the world all to myself, was intoxicating. But the memory of that gaze, of that cold shiver in the workshop, tormented me. I looked at my mother. She was standing next to the fireplace, her shoulders rigid. She didn't say a word, but her silence was more eloquent than any scream. It was a silence filled with terror, a desperate and mute warning that I, in my teenage naivety, was not able to fully understand. I only saw the possibility of escaping, even for just a few hours a day, from the silent prison of my home. I couldn't have known that I was only about to enter a larger and much darker cage. My first day of work at the mill was like entering another world. I left our house, wrapped in the tense silence and the smell of my father's wood, and walked the short distance to the large red brick building that dominated our town. Crossing that gate was like crossing an invisible border. The air itself changed. The smell of resin and sawdust was replaced by a new scent, a mixture of machine oil, raw cotton, and a feverish, almost electric energy I had never known. And then there was the noise. A deafening sound, a constant and rhythmic thunder that entered your bones, shook your chest, and made any thought impossible. It was the song of the looms, dozens and dozens of machines working in unison, devouring threads of cotton and spitting out yards of fabric. For the first time in my life, I found myself in a place where silence did not exist, where every corner was filled with that industrious din. And, strangely, I felt safe. In that deafening noise, no one could hear your thoughts. No one could judge your silence. The office where I was to work was an island of relative quiet in the middle of that ocean of noise. It was a small room with a large window overlooking the courtyard, separated from the production area by a thick brick wall. Here, the song of the looms arrived muffled, a background hum that marked the hours. My job was simple: to file delivery notes, copy accounting ledgers in neat handwriting, and answer the phone. It was a meticulous job that required patience and precision, qualities I had inherited from my father. The smell of the room was that of old paper, ink, and glue. For me, it was the scent of freedom. During the first few weeks, Mr. Peterson was the perfect boss. He showed up rarely, and when he did, he was always professional, almost formal. He would stop by the office in the morning to give the day's directives, check my work with a quick glance, nod in approval, and leave. "Good, Patricia," he would say. "You're precise. Your father told me you were a sharp girl." Those words of praise, spoken by such an important man, were a balm to my soul, accustomed only to my father's silent criticisms. I began to relax. The fear I had felt in the workshop now seemed like an absurd teenage fantasy. I felt competent, useful. For the first time in my life, I was someone outside the walls of my home. The most intoxicating feeling was receiving my first paycheck. A small brown envelope with a few bills inside. But for me, it was an inestimable treasure. I held it tight in my dress pocket all the way home, feeling the rustle of the paper with every step. It was the first thing that was truly and uniquely mine. I didn't have to ask for permission to spend it. I didn't have to justify it. That evening, at home, the tension was palpable. My father was radiant with a possessive pride. "My Patricia," he said to the neighbors we ran into on the street. "She works for Peterson, a young lady." My mother, however, looked at me with an anxiety she couldn't hide. When I showed her the envelope, she looked at it as if it were a snake. "Put them away, dear," she whispered. "Don't look too happy about it." I didn't understand her warning. I was happy. The fear that had gripped me seemed like a distant memory, a shadow banished by the light of my new independence. I started to believe that maybe, for me, the world could be a different place. A place where my value wasn't measured by the perfection of a pot roast or the docility of my silence. The subtle crack in this new, fragile reality appeared after about a month. Mr. Peterson's visits to my office began to become more frequent and longer. He no longer came just for work matters. He would find excuses, a document that couldn't be found, a phone call to make from my line, and his comments began to change. He no longer praised just my work, but me. "That ribbon in your hair suits you very well, Patricia. You have beautiful handwriting, elegant just like you. You should smile more often. You light up this room." They were kind words on the surface, harmless compliments. But the way he said them, his gaze lingering on me for a moment too long, made me feel uncomfortable. A small alarm began to ring in my head, faint but persistent. He also began to subtly violate my space. He would get close to look at a ledger and lean over me, so close I could feel his scent of tobacco and the warmth of his body. His hand, while pointing to a number on a page, would accidentally brush against mine. Every time, I would recoil with a small start, and he would pretend not to notice, continuing to talk about work in his calm, authoritative voice. I was confused, terribly confused. A part of me felt flattered. The most important man in town was paying attention to me. But another part, an older, deeper instinct, smelled danger. I felt guilty for these thoughts. Was I misunderstanding his kindness? Was I being ungrateful? If I complained, what could I complain about? That my boss was being nice to me? That he was complimenting me? I would have seemed crazy, ungrateful. And my father, I didn't even dare to imagine his reaction. He would have accused me of having ruined everything, of having dishonored his name with my stupidity. And so I did what I had learned to do since I was a child. I kept quiet, and I smiled. The situation got worse. He began to give me tasks that forced me to stay in the office after closing time, when the other workers had already left and the deafening song of the looms had stopped. The factory, emptied of its army of workers, became a ghostly place. The silence that fell was even more unsettling than the noise, because now I could hear every single creak, every distant step. During those hours, he would join me in the office. The door would open, and he would be there, with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Still here, Patricia? What a tireless worker." We would talk. Or rather, he would talk. He would tell me about his business, his travels, and his wife, who, he said, didn't understand him. He painted himself as a lonely man, a misunderstood giant. And I would listen, paralyzed, not knowing what to say, feeling smaller and more trapped with every passing moment. The room, which had once seemed like a refuge, had become a cage, and he was my smiling jailer. The day the world broke was a Friday afternoon in late November. The sky was gray and low, promising rain. The workers had left in a hurry, eager to return to the warmth of their homes. I, as usual, had stayed to finish filing some invoices. Mr. Peterson entered the office. He had a strange look, a feverish excitement in his eyes. "Patricia," he said in a falsely casual tone, "I have an emergency. I absolutely have to find the supply contract with that mill in Philadelphia. It must be from 52 or 53. I know it's a nuisance, but it's in the dead archive, in the basement. Could you look for it for me? It's a matter of vital importance. The Dead Archive. It was a damp, windowless room in the basement where decades-old documents were piled up. I had only been there once and had left with a sense of suffocation. It was a forgotten place. I hesitated. But Mr. Peterson, it's late. I know, my dear. But it's a real emergency. I'll be eternally grateful. His tone did not allow for a rebuttal. It was the gentle order of a king. I nodded, unable to refuse. He gave me a large set of keys and pointed to the basement door. I went down the stone stairs, my steps echoing in the silence. The air was cold and smelled of mold and decaying paper. I opened the heavy wooden door of the archive. Inside, the darkness was almost total. There was only one dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long, unsettling shadows on the shelves laden with files. I started to search, my heart pounding. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rustling of the paper I was leafing through. I felt like a mouse in a trap. With every passing minute, my anxiety grew. Then I heard footsteps on the stairs. The archive door opened. It was him. "Found anything?" he asked, his voice unnaturally loud in the cramped space. "Not yet," I murmured without turning around. He came in and closed the door behind him. The click of the lock was the most terrible sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of the world closing outside, leaving me alone with him. I spun around. He was standing, leaning against the door, and he was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on him. The mask of the good giant had fallen. In its place was something else, something hungry, predatory. "You know, Patricia," he said, his voice reduced to an oily whisper. "I've been watching you for a while. You're such a serious, well-behaved girl. I like you." My blood ran cold. My voice had turned into a piece of ice in my throat. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I could only look at him, paralyzed by terror. He came closer. Every step he took echoed on the concrete floor. The space between us shrunk until it disappeared. I could smell his scent of tobacco, so strong it made me nauseous. His hands rested on my shoulders. They were heavy, possessive. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he whispered. But his words were a lie. Everything about him was a lie. And then the universe shrank to that damp, dusty room. Time stopped. It broke. It shattered into a million sharp fragments. My voice was a butterfly trapped in the glass of my throat. It beat its wings, but made no sound. My body was no longer mine. It was an object, a thing in his hands. I dissociated. My mind fled, taking refuge in a remote corner of my brain, and from there I watched, as if I were watching a silent, terrible movie, what was happening to a girl who looked like me. I focused on a spider web in a corner of the ceiling, watching a spider motionless in the center of its trap. It was me. I was the spider, and at the same time the fly. I was trapped and motionless, waiting. I don't know how much time passed. A few minutes? An eternity? When it was all over, he composed himself, straightened his jacket, as if nothing had happened. He avoided my gaze. He went to the door and opened it. Before leaving, he turned and said to me, in a voice that was once again cold and professional, "You won't find that document. It never existed. This conversation never happened. You will continue to be my good secretary, and I will be your generous employer. Do we understand each other?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. He left, leaving the door open. I was left alone in the silence, in the smell of mold. My body began to tremble uncontrollably. I felt dirty, in a way that no water could ever wash away. I don't know how I managed to go up the stairs, gather my things from the office, and leave the factory. The outside world seemed surreal. The lights of the town, the people walking, Everything seemed distant, as if seen through thick, distorting glass. I walked home like an automaton. My feet moved, but I wasn't there. When I opened the door of the house, the smell of sawdust hit me like a slap. My father was in the kitchen, reading the newspaper. He looked up. "Late tonight," he said, with a note of pride. "Peterson works you hard, huh? Good. It means he trusts you." I didn't answer. I walked past him, heading for my room. It was my mother who stopped me. She was in the doorway of the hallway. She didn't say a word. She just looked at my face. And in her eyes, I saw no surprise, no questions. I saw an ancient, terrible, resigned understanding. I saw the reflection of my own pain, a pain she knew all too well. She reached out and touched my arm. Her touch was light, trembling, and in that single gesture, she told me everything she could never say in words. She told me that she knew. She told me that she believed me. And she told me that there was nothing, absolutely nothing, that we could do. She silently led me to my bedroom. She made me sit on the bed. And she stood there, next to me, a mute and powerless sentinel guarding a disaster that had already occurred. That night, the silence in our house was heavier, deeper, and blacker than any darkness I had ever known. It was the silence of shame, the silence of the secret, the silence of two women trapped in the same, identical prison. The first morning after was the hardest of my life. The sun filtered through the blinds of my room as usual, indifferent to the fact that the world, my world, had been irretrievably shattered. I opened my eyes, and for a single, blessed instant, I didn't remember. It was only a second of peace, a clean breath, before the memory fell upon me with the weight of a marble slab, crushing me back into the damp, dusty darkness of that basement. My own body felt alien to me, a prison of flesh that bore a violation no one could see, but that I felt in every fiber of my being. I lay motionless, curled up under the blankets, wanting to dissolve, to stop existing, to turn back to dust. But the noise of life outside my door wouldn't allow it. I heard my mother's light footsteps in the kitchen, the clinking of a teacup. Life, with unbearable cruelty, went on. When I finally found the strength to get up, I moved like an old woman. Every gesture was an immense effort. Getting dressed, combing my hair, were mechanical actions performed by a body that no longer belonged to me. When I entered the kitchen, I found my mother. She didn't look at me right away. She was making coffee, her shoulders rigid, her back a wall of silence. But I knew she was aware of my every breath, my every hesitant movement. On the table, next to my cup, she had placed a slice of jam pie, my favorite. It was a small, desperate, and completely useless attempt at normalcy. A gesture of love so powerless it broke my heart. We sat at the table, facing each other, in a bubble of silence so dense it seemed to have a physical weight. She didn't ask anything. She didn't say, "How are you?" She didn't need to. She knew, and I knew that she knew. We communicated in a language that only those who have shared a deep suffering can understand. A language made of avoided glances, of slowed gestures, of a held breath. It was a conspiracy of pain, a pact of silence made without a single word being uttered. The real nightmare began when we heard my father's heavy footsteps. He entered the kitchen, bringing with him the clean, strong smell of sawdust. He was in a good mood. He had slept well. The world, for him, was exactly as he had left it the night before. An orderly place, under his control. "Good morning," he said in a loud voice. He sat down in his chair, unaware of the spiderweb of pain that enveloped me and his wife. "So, Patricia, ready for another day with the great Mr. Peterson?" His name, spoken with such lightness, with so much pride. It was as if they had pressed a burning coal against my skin. A wave of nausea rose in my throat. I lowered my head, staring at my cup of milk, praying to become invisible. I managed to mumble a, "Yes, Dad," that sounded more like the whimper of a dying kitten. He didn't notice. He began to talk about a job he was doing, a particularly difficult piece of walnut to work with. And I had to sit there, swallowing my milk and my despair, playing the part of the dutiful daughter, while everything inside me was a field of ruins. Every second spent at that table was torture. Every proud word of his about my work was an insult. His unawareness was a condemnation. The walk to the mill was an ordeal. Every step that brought me closer to that red brick building was a step towards hell. The town streets, which I had walked thousands of times, seemed strange, hostile. I felt naked, branded. I was certain that everyone could see me, that my shame was a dark aura visible to anyone. I passed the minister, who greeted me with a smile. I smiled back, a horrible grimace that pulled at the muscles of my face. I passed women returning from the market, chatting. They looked at me and said hello. I managed to give a nod. Every normal interaction was a superhuman effort. I just wanted to scream, to run away, to hide. But where? The whole world had become the scene of my crime, and I was the only defendant. Entering the office was the peak of the torture. He was already there, sitting at his desk, reading papers. He looked up when I came in. "Good morning, Patricia," he said, in a perfectly normal, professional tone, as if nothing had happened the day before, as if he hadn't destroyed me in a dark basement. That normality was the most perverse form of cruelty. He was showing me that for him, what had happened had no weight, no meaning. I was an object he had used and then put back on the shelf. The day passed in a fog of dissociation. I performed my tasks like an automaton. My handwriting, usually so precise, was shaky. I knocked over the ink. I made several calculation errors. My body was there, but my mind was far away, huddled in a dark corner, trembling. He made no comments about my mistakes. In fact, he was almost kind, in a distant, formal way that was even more chilling. Every time he approached my desk, my body would turn to stone. The sound of his voice made me flinch. The song of the looms, which had once given me a sense of protection, now seemed like an infernal cacophony, a noise trying to cover the silent scream of my soul. The days that followed blurred into a single, long gray nightmare. At home, the silence between my mother and me had become even deeper, but now it was a different silence, a knowing silence. She took care of me with small gestures. She tucked me in at night. She left a flower from her garden on my nightstand. She didn't speak, but her eyes said, "I'm here, I see you." But her presence was as much a comfort as a condemnation, because in her eyes I also saw her total and complete powerlessness. And I saw her terror, not for what had happened to me, but for what would happen if my father found out. And my father, the man who saw nothing because he only looked at himself, began to notice that something was wrong. He didn't notice it with the intuition of a loving father. He noticed it with the critical eye of a craftsman who sees an imperfection in his work. I was one of his creations, and my sadness, my apathy, were flaws that ruined the image of perfection he wanted to project to the world. He started with curt, impatient questions. "Why aren't you eating? Don't you like what your mother cooked? You look sick. You're not getting ill, are you? We can't afford that. Is that job at the mill perhaps too hard for you? I thought you were stronger." Every question was an accusation. My suffering was an annoyance, an inconvenience that disturbed his peace. Not getting answers from me, he took it out on my mother. I would hear them arguing in the evenings, their voices subdued, filtering through my bedroom door. His, hard and inquisitorial. My mother's, a broken, defensive murmur. "What's wrong with your daughter? You're her mother. You should know what's bothering her. Aren't you taking good enough care of her? It's your fault she's so fragile." He blamed her, as always. It was easier for him to accuse my mother of negligence than to admit that something in his perfectly controlled universe could go wrong. But the days passed, and I didn't get better. I got worse. I had terrible nightmares that made me wake up with a start, a silent scream stuck in my throat. I lost weight. At the table, I would stare into space. And my father, the great observer, the master of details, understood that the cause was not a simple illness or my mother's negligence. His gaze toward me changed. It became sharper, more inquisitive. He began to study me, to dissect me with his eyes. I felt like a piece of wood on his workbench while he searched for the wrong grain, the hidden crack. He observed the way I flinched when he raised his voice. He noticed how my eyes filled with terror when the conversation turned to Mr. Peterson. And most importantly, he noticed the unnatural silence between my mother and me. He saw the glances we exchanged, the quickness with which we stopped talking when he entered a room. He understood that we were allies, that we shared a secret from which he was excluded. And this, for a man obsessed with control like him, was intolerable. One evening at the dinner table, he set his trap. He was making small talk, an almost affable demeanor that was his most dangerous way of being. Then, in a falsely casual tone, he asked me, "So, Patricia, is Peterson still happy with your work? Does he treat you well?" The world stopped. I felt my mother's gaze on me, full of panic. I felt my heart hammering in my ears. I had to answer. I had to lie. And the lie had to be perfect. I tried to conjure a smile. "Yes, Dad," I said, my voice a thin, trembling thread. "Everything's fine. Mr. Peterson is very kind." It was a catastrophic mistake. My voice trembled too much. My smile was a grimace. My lie was as transparent as glass. I saw a flash pass in my father's eyes, a flash of cold, terrifying understanding. He said nothing. He nodded slowly and continued to eat. But I knew. He, in that moment, had understood. He didn't know the details. He didn't know how or when. But he had understood that the source of my torment had a name: Gerald Peterson. From that evening on, my father changed. He became a silent hunter. The rage that grew within him was not the hot, impulsive fury of a father wanting to protect his daughter. It was a cold, methodical, calculating fury. It was the rage of a king whose territory had been violated, whose property had been damaged. I was not his daughter to protect. I was his honor to avenge. He began to move like a shadow. He no longer asked me questions. He no longer spoke of the subject, but I felt his eyes on me constantly. Sometimes from the office, I thought I saw him across the square, standing still, watching the entrance to the factory. I thought I was going crazy, that I was imagining things. But I wasn't. He was studying his prey, learning his habits, planning his attack. My mother lived in a state of constant terror. I would hear her crying at night, softly, in her room. We were waiting. We were two powerless women, prisoners in a house with a ticking time bomb that was inexorably counting down to an explosion. The detonation occurred about a week later. It was a dark, moonless evening. My father returned from the workshop for dinner. He was strangely calm, with an unnatural stillness that sent a chill through my veins. He ate in silence, slowly. Then, when he had finished, he turned to us. His voice was low, devoid of inflection. "I have an urgent job to finish. A client is coming to pick it up later. I'll be working late tonight." He stood up. On the kitchen threshold, he stopped and added, without turning around, "Lock the door, and don't open it for anyone, for any reason, until I return." My mother and I looked at each other. We knew. This was not a night for work. It was a night of judgment. We locked ourselves in the house, and the silence became our jailer. Every creak of the wood made us jump. An hour passed. 2. Then, we heard the noise. The shrill, unmistakable wail of the large band saw starting up in the workshop. But it was not the continuous, steady sound of work. It was an irregular, angry sound. A roar that lasted a few seconds, then stopped. Silence. And then again, another roar, more violent. And amidst those roars, I thought I heard something else. A lower, more guttural sound. Was it a scream, muffled by the noise of the saw? Or was it just the wood groaning under the blade? My mind refused to understand, but my heart knew. My mother came into my room, her face a mask of wax. We didn't speak. She sat on my bed and took my hand. Her fingers were icy. We stayed that way, huddled in the dark, listening to the symphony of horror coming from the workshop, listening to my father as he delivered his justice in his own way. Listening to the sound of a man being taken apart, piece by piece, like an old piece of furniture. After a time that felt like an eternity, everything went quiet. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was a dense, heavy, stained silence. We waited, trembling. Another hour passed before we heard the front door open and close. We heard his heavy footsteps in the kitchen, the sound of water running from the faucet for a long time. I saw my mother make the sign of the cross. Then he appeared on the threshold of my room. The hallway light framed him, transforming him into a dark, imposing silhouette. I couldn't see his face, but I could smell his scent. The smell of sawdust was mixed with something else, a sour, metallic odor, the smell of the secret that would bind our lives forever. He fixed his gaze on me in the darkness. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, definitive. "You won't work there anymore," he said. "The problem has been resolved." In that moment, I understood. I understood that I had not been saved. I had only changed hands. I had escaped the golden cage of a rich and powerful man, only to end up in the wood and steel prison of my father. A much smaller, much darker prison, from whose bars I could never escape. Because now I owed him everything. I owed him my life, and I owed him above all my silence. The morning after my father's justice, our house was no longer a home. It had become a tomb sealed from the inside. The air itself had changed. It had become heavy, thin, as if the terrible secret from the night before had consumed all the oxygen. We sat down for breakfast, the three of us, in a silence that was different from all the silences we had known before. It was not the tense silence that preceded his outburst, nor the punitive silence that followed. It was a dense, complicit, and sacred silence, the silence of those who have participated in a terrible and irrevocable ritual. My father, Walter, was in his usual place at the head of the table. But he was no longer just a father or a husband. He had become a judge, an executioner, and a god. His face was a mask of granite, but in his eyes there was a new light, a terrifying calm, the calm of a man who has imposed his order on the chaos of the world and found things to be right. My mother, Lillian, was a statue of salt, her gaze lost in the emptiness of her coffee cup. And I was the sacrifice on the altar, the lamb whose supposed salvation had cost another soul and had chained mine for eternity. No one spoke of what had happened. No one ever would again. But the smell in the house had changed. Beneath the usual penetrating scent of sawdust, there was a new undertone, an almost imperceptible, metallic, and sickly sweet smell that seemed to come from my father's own skin, no matter how long he washed his hands. It was the smell of absolute power. In the days that followed, the story spread through the town like a slow, poisonous wave. Not the true story, of course. That remained buried under a layer of sawdust and fear in our workshop. The story everyone told was that of a tragic, unfortunate accident. They recounted how Mr. Gerald Peterson having gone to Walter's late at night to discuss a job, had slipped in the darkness of the workshop, falling against the blade of the large band, saw that my poor father had left running by mistake for just a few moments. My father, the story went, was a hero. He had acted with speed, turned off the machine, called the doctor, and saved his life. A hero. I would listen to these stories when my mother, too frightened to go out, would send me to buy bread or milk. I would listen to the women who spoke in low voices outside the store, the men who shook their heads at the coffee shop. "Poor Gerald," they would say, "ruined. The doctor says he won't be able to walk properly again. And his voice? They say the scream ruined his vocal cords forever." "And to think of Walter," someone else would add. "What a fright he must have had. Such a good, honest man to witness such a scene in his own workshop." But beneath the words of compassion, I felt another current, darker and deeper. I felt the fear. When people saw me, they would lower their gaze. When my father walked through the square, silence would fall. The men who used to clap him on the back now gave him a stiff, respectful nod. No one argued about his prices anymore. No one dared to contradict him. The official story was that of the accident, but the unspoken story, the one that traveled in glances and silences, was another. It was the story of a quiet man who was not to be provoked. It was the story of a boundary that had been crossed and a terrible punishment that had been inflicted. My father was no longer just the best carpenter in the region. He had become a dark legend, a man whose tranquility was more menacing than any shout. And I, his daughter, had become the living and silent emblem of his power. People would look at me and see his honor avenged. I was a trophy, a relic, the cause and the consequence of everything. My life, which had tasted a brief, illusory moment of freedom, closed in on itself like a tomb. The walls of our house became the borders of my world. My routine was a rosary of domestic duties recited day after day, cleaning, cooking, mending, helping my mother in the garden. The windows were my only eyes on the world. From there, I would watch girls my age stroll by, laughing, getting engaged, getting married. I watched them live a life that was forever denied to me. I did not feel envy. Envy is an emotion that requires a spark of hope, the belief that things could be different. And I had buried hope in that damp basement. My father had forged my prison, and the weapon with which he held me chained was his silence. He never said to me, "I forbid you to go out." He never said to me, "You can't have friends." He didn't need to. His control was much more subtle and much more powerful. It was a control based on a poisonous gratitude and an unwritten debt that I knew I could never repay. If I ever hinted at a desire, no matter how small, maybe on Sunday I could go to church with Mary's cousins, he wouldn't get angry. He would look at me with his calm, impenetrable eyes and say, in a flat voice, "In this house, you are safe, Patricia. Outside, as you have seen, the world is a dangerous place. I did what I had to do to protect this family. The least I ask in return is prudence." What I did to protect this family. That phrase was the key to my cell. It was a constant reminder. He was my savior. He had gotten his hands dirty for me. He had risked everything to avenge my honor. How could I defy him? How could I be so ungrateful as to want something as trivial as a walk, after he had performed such a terrible and final act for me? Every one of my desires for normalcy seemed like a betrayal, so I stopped desiring. I learned to extinguish every spark of life within me, to become quiet, obedient, silent, exactly as he wanted. The workshop, once my magical kingdom, had become the torture chamber of my mind. The sound of the saw, which was once a lullaby, was now a scream. Whenever my father was dissatisfied with something, an answer he didn't like, a slightly burnt dish, a shadow on my face, he wouldn't waste words. He would go into the workshop and turn on the saw. That sudden, angry noise was a form of conditioning. My body would react before my mind. My heart would start pounding, my breath would shorten, a cold sweat would bead on my forehead. My mother and I would freeze, wherever we were, whatever we were doing, and we would remain waiting, holding our breath until the noise stopped. It was his way of reminding us who was in command, of reminding us what he was capable of. When I turned 20, a young man from town, the baker's son, a kind and courageous boy, tried to approach me. He would wait for me outside the church, saying a few shy words. For a few weeks, I allowed a small, fragile plant of hope to take root in the desert of my heart. I almost felt like a normal girl. But my father saw everything. One afternoon, I saw him talking to the boy's father in front of the workshop. I didn't hear the words. I only saw my father's deadly calm, his hand resting amicably on the other man's shoulder, a gesture I knew was a threat. I saw the baker turn pale, nod quickly, and almost run away. The next day, and for all the days to come, his son never spoke to me again. He would turn his gaze away when he passed me, as if I were sick with the plague. That was the last time anyone dared to approach me. My father had put an invisible fence around me, a fence built with fear. I was his property, and no one was to dare touch it. The years passed all the same, marked by the succession of seasons seen from the same window. Summers followed springs, winters followed autumns. I became a woman in the shadow of the workshop. My body changed, but my life was immobile, frozen on the day of that terrible secret. And while I was frozen, my mother began to fade. The weight of that secret, the constant tension, the fear that never left her, were consuming her from within. It started with a slight tremor in her hands, which she tried to hide by keeping them clasped in her lap. Then came the sleepless nights, the constant headaches, a tiredness so deep that she would sometimes fall asleep in her chair in the middle of a sewing project. The doctor, an old and brusque man, said it was nervous exhaustion. He would prescribe drops that left her dazed but gave her no peace. But I knew the truth. It was not nervous exhaustion. It was my father's poison that was slowly extinguishing her life. The final act of her destruction occurred in the only place where she was still sovereign, her garden. That was her sanctuary, the small piece of land where her trembling hands could still create life and beauty. Her flowers were the most beautiful in town, her vegetables the most flavorful. One day, my father decided that the garden was not efficient. "Too many useless flowers," he decreed. "We'll plant more potatoes here. They're for food, not just for show." And so, with the same cold methodicalness with which he had destroyed a man, he destroyed my mother's small world. He uprooted her beloved roses, her geraniums, her dahlias. He threw them on the compost heap as if they were weeds, and in their place he planted row after monotonous, efficient row of potatoes. My mother watched from the kitchen window, motionless. She did not cry. She did not say a word, but I saw something die in her eyes that day. I saw her last small flame of resistance go out, leaving only ashes. From that day on, she almost completely stopped talking. She moved through the house like a shadow, fulfilling her duties in a tomb-like silence. Sometimes I would catch her staring into space, her eyes empty, her mouth slightly open, as if she had forgotten even to breathe. Her memory began to waver. She would forget pots on the stove. She couldn't remember where she had put her glasses. She was slipping away, slowly, to a place where neither my father nor I could reach her anymore. Late one evening, I found her sitting at the kitchen table in the dark. She was holding the old, faded photograph of herself as a young girl, the one with the bright smile and eyes full of life. I sat across from her in silence. For the first time in years, she broke it. Her voice was a fragile whisper, like the rustling of dry leaves. "This photo," she said without looking at me, still staring at the image. My brother took it in the old town. It was the patron saint's festival. I was 17. That morning, a boy had given me that bunch of wildflowers. His name was Marco. We wanted to get married. She paused for a long time. Then I met your father. Everyone said he was a good man, a hard worker, a good catch. My mother insisted. Another pause, even longer. Marco left for America. I never saw him again. She stroked the photograph with a trembling thumb. Then, finally, she looked up and her gaze landed on me. In her empty eyes, I saw a final, desperate spark of lucidity. "Don't let him," she whispered, with an urgency that pierced my heart. "Don't let him steal your memories, Patricia. They're the only thing he can't touch. Hold on to them." It was the last real conversation I ever had with my mother. A few weeks later, pneumonia took her away, in her bed, in silence, almost with gratitude. At her funeral, the whole town was present. Everyone mourned the poor, sweet Lillian. And everyone praised my father, Walter, for the devotion with which he had cared for her. A model husband, until the end. I was there, standing next to him, dressed in black, dry of tears, feeling like the loneliest person on the face of the earth. Now it was just him and me. My guardian was dead, and I was left alone with the jailer. With my mother gone, the house became a hollow shell, an echo of silences. The silence before had been a living silence, a three-part harmony in which every held breath, every light step, every unsaid glance communicated volumes of fear and complicity. Now it was the silence of emptiness. The silence of two strangers bound by a crime and a roof. My father and I, the prisoner and her jailer, now the sole inhabitants of our fortress of wood and secrets. Her absence was a physical, tangible presence. I saw it in the empty chair at the table, in the untouched bed, in the garden where her beloved roses had been replaced by monotonous rows of potatoes. Every corner of the house screamed her name, and every scream was a silent accusation to both of us, to him for stealing her life, and to me for standing by and watching. The years began to pass, slow and inexorable, like a drop of water wearing away stone. My father, Walter, the man who seemed sculpted from oak, began to age. His back, once straight and strong, hunched over. His hands, which had dominated wood with such mastery, began to tremble, betrayed by an arthritis that no iron will could stop. The man who had been a giant, the feared king of our town, was slowly shrinking, becoming a fragile, dependent old man. And his dependence fell entirely on me. I became his nurse, as well as his prisoner. I had to prepare his meals, make sure he took his medicines, and help him get dressed in the morning. This new dynamic was a particularly perverse form of torture. Every morning, as I buttoned his shirt, my fingers were inches from his throat. And in those moments, dark thoughts, thoughts that made me ashamed of my own soul, would cross my mind. I imagined tightening my grip, putting an end to decades of suffering with a single simple gesture. But then I would see his fragility, his labored breathing, and the image would dissolve, leaving in its place only the bitter taste of my powerlessness and a twisted, sick sense of duty that I could not get rid of. He never thanked me. He took my service for granted, just as he had taken my silence for granted. His tyranny had not diminished with his physical strength. It had simply transformed, becoming more petulant, more demanding, the tyranny of a king in exile within his own body. My life was a never-ending purgatory. But then, something changed. A young couple moved into the house next door, which had been empty for years. Their names were Marco and Elena, and they had a little girl of about 5 with dark curls and eyes full of fearless curiosity. Her name was Sophia. From the kitchen window, which had become my watchtower on the world, I watched them live. I watched them hang curtains, work in the garden, and laugh as they chased each other with a bucket of water. I could hear their music, their animated discussions, the child's crying at night, and her father's whispered lullabies. They were a celebration of life, a chaotic and wonderful spectacle of normalcy. They were everything I had never been and never would be. Every one of their laughs was a stab to my heart, a painful reminder of everything that had been stolen from me. And at the same time, they were a sip of water for a soul that was dying of thirst. Little Sophia was not afraid of us. She didn't know the stories, the whispers, the dark reputation that surrounded our house. To her, I was just the lady next door. She began to talk to me through the old fence that separated our yards. She would ask me questions about the shape of the clouds, show me a flower she had picked, and tell me the stories her mother would invent for her. I would answer her with a few words, my voice stiff and rusty from disuse. But every day, I eagerly awaited those small, brief moments of contact. That child, with her innocence, was slowly and unknowingly casting a little light into the cracks of my prison. One late spring afternoon, the inevitable happened. I was in the kitchen. My father was in his armchair in the living room, dozing. I heard Sophia's laughter as she played ball in her yard. Then, a sudden silence, followed by a small, "uh-oh." I looked out the window and saw her red ball had rolled through our open gate and landed right in front of the wide-open workshop door. The workshop, the sacred temple, the place of judgment, a place where no one, except my father, had set foot for decades. I saw the child hesitate, look towards her house, then towards the ball. And then, with the unconscious courage of her 5 years, she scurried into the workshop to retrieve her toy. At that precise moment, my father woke up. Perhaps he had heard the noise, or perhaps a predator's sixth sense had alerted him that his territory had been violated. He rose from his armchair faster than I had seen him move in years. I followed him with my gaze as he went outside, heading for the workshop. My heart stopped. When I reached the threshold, the scene I saw froze time. My father was holding little Sophia by the arm, his grip strong despite his trembling hands. His face, usually a mask of senile apathy, was contorted into a grimace of pure fury. It was the same expression I had seen that evening at the dinner table, over a little too much salt. It was the cold, absolute rage of a king whose decree had been broken. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, his voice a poisonous breath. "This is private property. You are not to come in here, ever." The child was terrified. Her little face was a mask of silent tears. Her body trembled. She couldn't speak, only sob. And in that moment, seeing the pure terror in that child's eyes, the dam inside me broke. 40 years of silence, of fear, of repressed pain, shattered in a single, blinding wave of clarity. I no longer saw the neighbor's daughter. I saw myself in a dark basement. I saw my mother with a bruise on her cheekbone, whispering. I tripped. I saw the ghost of Gerald Peterson, a ruined man. And I remembered the promise I had made to my mother's soul. Don't let him steal your memories. That promise transformed. It became something greater, something more urgent. It became a battle cry. I will not let him steal another life. A sound came from my throat, a sound I hadn't made in decades, my father's name. Walter! Not Dad. Walter. He spun around, surprised by my voice, by its tone. He looked at me as if he were seeing me for the first time. In my eyes, there was no more fear. There was only a cold calm, a resolve I didn't know I possessed. I took a step forward, entering the workshop, into the heart of my nightmare. "Let her go," I said, my voice firm, without a tremor. He hesitated, then his rage shifted from her to me. He let go of the child's arm. She ran away crying, and he focused on me. "You!" he snarled. "How dare you? How dare you defy me in my own house? Ungrateful, after everything I did for you, after how I protected you, I saved you." It was his final weapon. The phrase that had held me chained for a lifetime, but it no longer worked. I looked him straight in the eyes. "You didn't save me," I said, and every word was a stone thrown against the wall of lies he had built. "You bought me. You paid with another man's body and soul, and you locked me up in this house for the rest of my life." "Be quiet," he yelled, his voice breaking with fury. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I know very well," I continued, and the words now flowed from me like a river in flood, unstoppable. "I've known every single day of my life. I knew when you silently hit Mom and then called her absent-minded. I knew the night you used that saw for something other than wood. And I knew you didn't do it for me. You never did anything for me. You did it for your pride, for your honor, because Peterson dared to touch your property. That's what I've always been to you. A well-made piece of furniture, an object to possess and display. And you destroyed Mom. You consumed her with fear. You even stole the flowers from her garden because you couldn't stand that something in this house could be beautiful and free without your permission." The workshop door was still open. The scene had attracted attention. I saw Marco and Elena, Sophia's parents, running toward us, their faces full of alarm and confusion. I saw other faces peeking out from nearby gates. My audience, my court, my father saw them. His instinct was to compose himself, to play the part of the wise, slandered old man. "Don't listen to her," he said, trying to modulate his voice. "Grief has made her confused. She's a fragile woman. She doesn't know what she's saying." But his mask no longer held. My voice was too strong. My truth was too clear. I took a step toward the neighbors. "This man," I said, pointing at him, "is not what you think. You see him as a righteous man, a hero. And he has spent his whole life feeding on your respect like a parasite. But the truth is that this man is a tyrant who held his wife and daughter prisoner for 57 years with fear and violence." The story of Gerald Peterson's accident. It was never an accident. It was his private justice, and I was his silent sentence. A murmur of shock and horror spread through the small crowd. I saw the faces of my neighbors change. I saw respect turn into doubt, doubt into disgust, disgust into contempt. In a few minutes, in the afternoon sunlight, the great, feared Walter, the pillar of the community, crumbled. His legend, so carefully built, turned to dust. He stood there, in the midst of his sawdust, no longer a king, no longer a giant, just a bad, lonely old man, stripped of his power, exposed in his pathetic nakedness. His castle of fear had collapsed, and all it had taken was a single, small word of truth. That day, I turned and walked out of that gate for the last time. I didn't take anything with me. I left 40 years of silence, fear, and pain inside. Marco and Elena took me into their home for the night, without asking questions, offering me a warmth and kindness I hadn't known in a long time. I never went back. I found a small room for rent on the other side of town. I found a humble job, mending clothes for the people in town. For the first time, I was breathing air that felt like my own. For the first time, I decided what to eat for dinner. For the first time, I walked down the street without feeling the weight of a gaze on my back. The healing was not a miracle. It was a long, slow process, like learning to walk again after being in bed for years. There were nights full of nightmares. There were days of a loneliness so deep it hurt my bones. But it was my loneliness. It was my pain. And for the first time, I was free to feel it, to face it, to overcome it. My father died a few years later, alone, in the house that had been his fortress and his prison. No one went to his funeral. Today, at 80 years old, I have a small garden. It's not big, but it's mine. It's full of roses, dahlias, and geraniums, my mother's favorite flowers. Sometimes, when the wind blows from the right direction, I can still smell a faint scent of sawdust coming from some new construction in the distance. It no longer scares me. It's just a smell, a memory of a life that is no longer mine. My father had condemned me to a life of silence, but he had forgotten one fundamental thing. Even the longest sentences, sooner or later, come to an end. And my freedom was not born from revenge, but from a single word, the first one, that taught all the others to follow. Freedom was born the day I stopped being a good girl and started being a real woman. Thank you for listening to me today, for allowing me to share with you this intimate chapter of my life. If my story has touched you, please don't hesitate to leave a like on this video and subscribe to this channel to discover other testimonies like mine. And please share it, because who knows, maybe someone going through a similar trial right now will find the courage to keep searching, to hope, to believe in the impossible. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to me.